Hey guys! I know this is a little bit different from the type of content I usually post on this channel, but if you know me, if you've seen my other videos, you know that being part of the queer community is a really important part of my identity, and it's something I feel very passionately about. And this is a debate that I have personally experienced in my local LGBTQ community, and that I've also seen reappearing in several places online, although it had been kind of quiet for several years. So I wanted to address it. I wanted to create a video that explores the history of this debate and the different sides of the argument, and hopefully explains why I personally feel that the word queer is really important and feel that banning it because of its history as a slur does more harm than good. So, before we get started, I have turned the script for this video into a written blog post, which will be linked in the description. So if you would rather read than listen, that's there for you as well. So, in case you're not familiar with this debate, despite having been used by queer groups as a self-identifier for almost 40 years, the rise of online LGBTQ spaces, especially on social media, has seen a revival of this controversy around the use of the word queer as an umbrella term for non-cisgender, non-heterosexual people. Many groups will ban the use of the word queer altogether because queer is a slur. This is inconsistent with the other language used in queer spaces and the way that we interact with labels, but it's also literally rooted in trans exclusionist radical feminist rhetoric designed to keep transgender, bisexual, and other marginalized groups out of LGBTQ spaces. I have some examples to show you guys. I am always wary to include people who disagree with me in videos like this because I don't want to out anybody. I don't want to call them out. I don't want to put them on blast or anything like that. But I do want to show you guys the context and to show you the actual arguments happening online because of this debate. So just keep that in mind with these examples. So here's an example where Twitter banned a self-identified queer woman, suspended her account, for using the word queer in a tweet to describe her own community, which the Twitter algorithm tagged as hate speech. There's also this event that went down on Tumblr. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but if you would like to pause the video and read it, the user, the semi-irritated blonde, spouts a lot of the rhetoric that I see people using when they argue that queer shouldn't be allowed as an identifier. I've also seen this especially on TikTok lately. Google Slides will not let me embed a TikTok in the video, but I will link this specific TikTok in the description, and I really encourage you to watch it and draw your own conclusions if you want to pause this video and do that real quick. Now, having seen this video, I think that this person makes some genuinely good points about the need to accommodate people who have been harmed by the use of anti-LGBTQ slurs, and also about respecting intersex people and other folks who don't consider themselves part of the queer community, even if they're not technically cisgender heterosexual. However, in the same breath, they say that only certain identities are allowed in the LGBTQ community, which does not sit right with me at all. They imply that queer is an inherently sexual label that is associated with BDSM, which is just factually incorrect. And they explicitly say that people who self-identify as queer are, and I quote, straight with extra steps. So, remember how in my video about Nazis and Norse paganism, we talked about how most of the ideas held by modern white supremacists can be traced back to a handful of bigots hiding behind the facade of academia? Turns out that's also the case here. Sheila Jeffreys has been hugely influential in two political movements that are still creating pain and division in queer spaces today: the political lesbian movement and the trans exclusive radical feminist movement. So, political lesbianism is also sometimes called lesbian feminism, and I want to make it clear that lesbians are fantastic, feminists are fantastic. Lesbian feminism is bad and hurts people. The political lesbian movement argues that women should cut off all contact with men and should focus all of their time, energy, and attention on other women. The movement also argues that regardless of their actual sexual orientation, women should only have romantic and sexual relationships with other women, which is actually where the term political lesbian comes from. What's very interesting to me is that although most queer people consider their identity an inherent part of who they are, for these women, being a lesbian is a political choice, not an inherent part of their identity. It's also worth noting that several of the founders of this movement were former members of the Gay Liberation Front, which is the group that was founded as a result of the Stonewall riots. And they left the Gay Liberation Front because they didn't like working with men and transgender activists. The trans exclusive radical feminist movement, which you may know better by the acronym TERF, is a form of radical feminism that very much grew out of lesbian feminism and similar movements. TERFs have a lot of the same beliefs as political lesbians, but in addition, they reject the idea that transgender women are women and advocate for the exclusion of trans women from women's spaces. Sheila Jeffreys has been very active in both of these movements since the 1980s. She's written several books that have defined decades of radical feminist thinking, including Gender Hurts, which was published in 2014 and directly challenges the experiences and identities of transgender people. Because political lesbians believe that men are inherently oppressive and that only correct relationships are those between women, they regard a lot of the queer community with suspicion or outright disgust, especially queer men, queer women who are attracted to men, and transgender women who they incorrectly see as men appropriating femininity. The reason I'm talking about Sheila Jeffreys is because in the 1980s and 1990s, LGBTQ people in academia started a movement called queer theory, which was an effort to create a shared space to discuss all non-cisgender, non-heterosexual experiences and the shared oppression that we all face. Now, activists, especially activists of color, had already started reclaiming the word queer. But this academic use helped normalize the use of queer as a positive umbrella term for everyone who isn't cis and straight. In this context, queer is a word that allows for a wide variety of experiences, including the experiences of people who don't have a label that fits them or who aren't yet sure how they identify. Sheila Jeffreys and other prominent political lesbian authors pushed back viciously against queer theory. Jeffreys wrote an article called The Queer Disappearance of Lesbians, where she argues, and this is a direct quote from the abstract of that article, "The developing field of lesbian and gay studies shows a likelihood to discriminate against the interests of lesbians, and certainly against lesbian feminist theory through its incorporation of a queer perspective." And the first line of that article is, "The appearance of queer theory and queer studies threatens to mean the disappearance of lesbians." Basically, her argument is that by celebrating a shared queer culture, including aspects of culture that were created by gay men, academia is giving into the patriarchy and erasing lesbian identity. She's especially critical of the aspects of queer culture that subvert or play with gender, such as drag. Later, in 2003, Jeffreys would publish a book called Unpacking Queer Politics that essentially argues that the reason lesbian feminism fell out of fashion wasn't because it was an inherently close-minded and reactionary movement, But because it was, and this is a quote from the back of that book, submerged in the 1990s beneath a gay male agenda called queer politics. The irony here is that by rejecting a shared queer identity, Jeffries is explicitly advocating for an LGBT academic field that centers cisgender lesbian women, while at the same time she's accusing queer theorists of centering cisgender gay men. Unfortunately, Jeffries and other authors who share her opinions gained a lot of followers both in the mainstream feminist movement and in the LGBT community, and we're still hearing echoes of their rhetoric decades later. Most people who argue against using the word queer are still repeating Jeffries' ideas, even if they don't realize it. Refusing to use the word queer or a similar umbrella term for the shared experiences of non-cishet people paves the way for gatekeeping and makes it easier to police who is allowed in LGBT spaces. As I mentioned earlier, Sheila Jeffries and her crowd are incredibly, vocally anti-transgender. They argue that trans people don't belong in gay and lesbian spaces, and they make huge efforts to exclude them. Self-identified queer spaces are also often the only spaces where bisexual and pansexual people feel welcome. People who are attracted to more than one gender often experience double discrimination, which means they experience both homophobia from outside the community and biphobia from within the community. This has been confirmed in multiple studies. A University of Massachusetts study led by Tangela Roberts found that the levels of discrimination bisexual people face from gay and lesbian people is only slightly lower than the level they face from straight people. Because queer spaces focus on shared experience rather than on specific identities, they're automatically more welcoming to bisexual and pansexual people, who often find themselves excluded from events and spaces that focus solely on gay and lesbian experiences. Because queer acknowledges a level of fluidity to human experiences, it creates spaces that are more welcoming not only to transgender people, but to non-binary and gender fluid folks who, like bisexuals, are often told that they're confused and need to pick a side. Queer as an umbrella term also allows space for identities that often don't get talked about at all in other LGBT forums, like asexuality. Asexual people are often pushed out of LGBT spaces, sometimes intentionally, and are told that they're basically straight, or even told that their identity is a mental illness. This is very similar to the way that Sheila Jeffries and her crew talk about transgender people, and it drives home a really important point. These exclusionists aren't really concerned about individual identities. Their actual goal is to make LGBT spaces inhospitable to people who are different from them. When a group chooses to identify with an acronym rather than an inclusive term like queer, they maintain the power to police which identities are allowed in their community. For example, many groups try to exclude certain identities by changing what the letters in their acronyms stand for. For example, a group might claim that the A in LGBTQIA stands for ally instead of asexual, or that the Q stands for questioning instead of queer. In other cases, groups will police presentation and behavior and will demand that people meet their criteria in order to be included. Even if they have a B in their acronym, bisexual people who can pass as straight or who have straight partners may be excluded. Even if the acronym has a T in it, that may only guarantee a space for transgender men and women, while non-binary, gender fluid, and agender folks are left out in the cold. This kind of gatekeeping is unfortunately common in LGBT groups, especially groups that buy into the queer is a slur discourse and other ideas with roots in political lesbianism. People are turned away for not being gay enough, or for being too gay, or for being gay in the wrong way. I don't want to focus too much on my personal experiences in this video, because this is a problem that is much bigger than just me and that affects the entire community. But that being said, it has been my personal experience that groups that banned the word queer, supposedly because its history as a slur, almost always follow this up with active or passive efforts to exclude certain queer identities from their space. This is a very common process called radicalization, and it's how someone who has some racist beliefs can slowly over time drift towards white supremacy. It's the same process. So, this is me, and I identify as queer. I don't feel like there's another label that accurately describes my sexuality. And in my experience, after groups ban the word queer, people like me are pressured to change the way we talk about our own identity because the language that feels comfortable for us is no longer deemed acceptable. We're pressured to call ourselves lesbian or gay or bisexual, even if we don't identify with those words. People who identify as genderqueer are pressured to change their label to non binary or gender fluid, even though that may not fully describe their experiences. People who aren't willing to change how they name and express their identity are shunned from the group or publicly shamed for using a slur. That's something that actually happened to me. I was publicly called out for using a slur because I referred to myself as a queer person. In my experience, the next step has always been to start phasing out acceptance of queer identities that political lesbians don't see as valid. Asexual people who are aromantic or heteroromantic will find themselves pushed out of conversations that increasingly focus on same gender relationships, as will queer people in opposite gender relationships and straight transgender people. The next step is usually to start openly excluding transgender people from the group. Remember, political lesbians and TERFs have a lot of overlap, so a lot of these people tend towards transphobia. This exclusion might include changing the language the group uses to talk about gender to be more biological essentialist, which means that gender is equated with anatomy. It might include enforcing a strict masculine-feminine binary and erasing identities that exist outside that binary. For me, this makes it almost impossible to talk about my experiences in a meaningful way. I'm someone who's attracted to multiple genders. I do not identify as bisexual. I do not identify as pansexual or polysexual or omnisexual. I am queer. My relationships are queer relationships. My community is a queer community. My gender is also queer. I'm a cisgender woman, but I experience womanhood in an inherently queer way. I do feel like my gender is woman, but also, in some cases, other. I'm not non-binary or gender fluid, and I'm someone who experiences gender in a very queer way. Queer woman, for me, is a label that covers both my sexuality and my gender. When I have that taken from me, I'm suddenly left unable to describe my experiences in an authentic way, and that's incredibly alienating. It makes me feel like I'm an outsider, even within a community that is supposed to be for people who exist outside the norm. This is why the word queer is so important. It's an inclusive, all-encompassing word that allows people to come together and celebrate a shared identity. It's more accessible, it includes more people, and it allows room for growth and individual experiences. Now, I do not want to invalidate the fact that many people have had the word queer used against them as a slur. I know from firsthand experience how painful it is to be called a slur because of your identity, and I would never want to make someone feel that their experiences of abuse and oppression don't matter. However, I take serious issue with the idea that the word queer is beyond reclaiming. The reality is, most of the words queer people use to self-identify today were originally used to demonize us or to medicalize our identities. Gay used to be a slur. Lesbian used to be both a slur and a medical diagnosis. We've always had to reclaim our identities from those who hate us. Reclaiming is inherent to our identities as queer people. Again, speaking from my personal experience, I've had the word gay used against me as a slur much more often than queer. I've also been called a lesbian by people who definitely intended it as a slur. So why are those words embraced by the community but queer isn't? The process of reclaiming queer began in the 1980s, more than 30 years ago, and only a couple of decades after the process of reclaiming gay and lesbian. It's one of the oldest words in our community's vocabulary. The idea that queer is a horrible slur that is unreclaimable is again something that comes from political lesbians who want to control who is allowed in queer spaces. The only difference between queer and other reclaimed slurs, like gay, is that queer does not have a strict definition, and so it can't be used to gatekeep people who identify with it. PhilosophyTube makes an excellent point about this in her YouTube video about the word queer, where she talks about how language changes over time. When thousands of people start using a word as a positive identifier, it takes power away from homophobes who would use it as a slur. And that's very much what we've seen happen in the last 30 years. So, people are different. And there's probably never going to be a community-wide consensus about what people who aren't cisgender and straight should be called as a collective. Maybe someday someone will invent an entirely new umbrella term that will fit even better than queer. But I hope that this video has illustrated the danger of banning words, taking words away from people, or trying to control how others identify. I sincerely hope that one day I will live in a world where I can say that I'm proud to be queer without people within my own community accusing me of homophobia. Whew. All right. Thank you guys for sticking through that with me. I am very thankful for being able to get this off my chest. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you learned something. All of my sources will be linked in the description for this video, and I highly encourage you to do some reading because this is definitely just the tip of the iceberg. I also realized that written sources may not be super helpful to people who have difficulty with reading. So I've also collected some YouTube videos that are relevant to the topics I covered in this video, and I've made a playlist that will be linked in the description if you'd rather get your information that way. I'll also list the individual videos, so if you want to really dive into a specific topic, you can just skip to that video. But thank you guys so much. I hope you have a